Hi, folks. Welcome to the New Thought Media Network, and welcome to Choice, your creative superpower. So, my name is Muro, and I am, as always, delighted to be your host. If you're coming back, it's good to have you here again. If this is your first time, welcome. We are here each Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 12 noon Mountain Time, to explore how you can use the amazing superpower of choice to co create your life experience for the greatest good. I'm a religious science practitioner at the Oakland Center for Spiritual Living in Northern California and a transformational coach. I work with people who are looking to live their lives to the fullest. Excuse me. In today's episode 26, we'll be looking at how choice relates to anxiety and fear. Now, I kept going back and forth between these topics. Do I want to keep them separate or do I want to bring them together? Obviously, I have made a decision. So, are they the same? I would say decidedly not. But here are a few differences that I found when I looked at how others define them. For example, anxiety follows from an unknown, expected, or poorly defined threat. Fear is seen as a reaction to a specific observable danger, while anxiety is seen as a diffuse, a kind of unfocused, objectless, future oriented fear. How about this one? Fear is an intense biological response to immediate danger, while anxiety is an emotion regarding things we think may happen. Does it matter how we view fear versus anxiety? I believe it does. And I believe it makes a difference both in the choices we make as a result of anxiety or fear, as well as our choices in how we address them. So, there's a couple of questions. Is fear a choice? Is anxiety a choice? I can state emphatically that they are indeed both choices, and neither is a choice. Yeah, I know I'm a terrible person. I really am. To a certain extent, I think the initial expression of anxiety or fear may not be a choice at all. I mean, for example, you step into the street and suddenly a car appears seemingly out of nowhere, causing you to jump back in fear, maybe even in fear for your life. Doesn't feel much like a choice to me. The next day, you decide that crossing that street is way too dangerous, so you avoid it entirely out of fear. Now, that does sound more like a choice. Oh, got to switch out the glasses here. Okay, now I can read comments. Hey, Christopher. Good afternoon to you, sir. Hope you're staying warm in Detroit. Okay, let's see. Where was I? Yes. So we jumped out of the way of the car out of fear, not a choice. However, the next day when we avoided that street out of fear, that was a choice. Let's try this one. Your significant other says to you, I like this one. Your significant other says, we need to talk. And the anxiety just kicks in. Was that a choice? I don't know. Could depend on what happened the last time you heard that phrase. The phone rings, and you see from caller ID, it's your friend Jake, who never calls during the day. So you start to imagine all the things that could be wrong. That feels like a choice to me. One thing that fear and anxiety most certainly share is the effect that they have on what we enjoy and what we do. So, a visit to an amusement park, all those crazy wild rides, provides lots of examples. I can tell you from my own experience that the last time I went to an amusement park with my grandchildren, I started the day with significant anxiety. I knew I didn't care for those rides at all. But my son, oh, my son and his kids, they love them. So that meant I was either going to be sitting a lot waiting for them to return from the rides, or I was going to be sharing in those thrills and potential nausea. Yeah, I chose the thrills and potential nausea. I would say that as this one ride we were on got faster and faster, and I could feel the pressure building in my chest as my vision reduced to a pinpoint, I, I was definitely fearful. So I was dealing with anxiety over what might happen and then fearful for what was happening. Let's look at the choices I made here. First of all, despite my anxiety about the rides, I knew my son and grandkids really wanted to go. So I chose to go with the program. Clearly a choice, and one that was not influenced by anxiety. The fear that I felt when the physical sensations became nearly unbearable, not a choice at all. But when the kids dragged me to another ride and I chose to sit that one out, now that was a clear choice, and that one was definitely based on fear. I did not want to go through that again. Here's another example. Recently, my wife and I went to a VR, it's virtual reality, interactive journey to space. I don't know how familiar you are with VR, but it's absolutely wild. So we wore this VR headset that completely closes us off to the real world around us. And it gave us this incredible number of wild and unbelievable experiences. I mean, it was like you were floating in space. You were being on the space station, inside the space station. It was incredible. Absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I had never done VR before, so I really didn't know what to expect. And I was definitely excited. But then they started telling us, okay, so here's what you need to do, and make sure you don't do this, and don't forget this, and remember that. And I became anxious. Would I remember everything I needed? Would I be able to find my wife? Or would I wind up talking to some random stranger who appears to me as, merely this floating light? Well, when they got us all set up, they explained that my wife and I, because we came in together, that we would appear as gold lights to one another, while everyone else would appear as blue lights. Well, to us. And then vice versa. So whatever group you were in, your group you'd recognize one another through the gold lights, and everyone else would be blue lights. Okay, so that reduced my anxiety. And then my headset stopped working, and I saw absolutely nothing at all. And the anxiety kicked in again. This time, I chose to remind myself, hey, I'm standing in a room. I'm surrounded by people. There was literally nothing that could harm me. Once we were underway again, I took a few halting steps, and I found myself in space. I mean, I looked down. There was nothing below me. Was I going to fall? I mean, that's how complete the VR experience can be. So it took me a while. But once I went through that fear anxiety cycle a couple more times, I made a conscious choice to relax into the experience. And it was magnificent. We'll definitely be going back for more VR. No question about it. I had to laugh at myself as I thought about this talk on fear and anxiety. Um, and I said to my wife, I said, I just had a crash course in how one moves from anxiety and fear to confidence and ease. So what did I do? How did that happen? Well, one of the first things that occurred to me that made a real difference was that when I wasn't being fully present to what was going on, I was at a distinct disadvantage. Once I chose to stop, center, and ground myself and be fully present, then the anxiety dissipated. Secondly, looking at my fear, by choosing to ask myself what I was actually afraid of, I could put everything into perspective. I mean, let's face it, in reality, the worst thing that was going to happen to me there was either that the employees at the VR center would just think it was hysterical watching this weird old guy trying to avoid floating away into space, or more likely, I would have wasted time that I could have enjoyed more completely. Hardly a danger or threat there at all. I remember one time early in my life being told that when you face a fearful situation, you have a choice to make. You can be afraid or you can be courageous. I'm pretty sure that came from my father. Folks, that was not particularly good advice. Here's why I say that. Nelson Mandela really addressed this perfectly when he said, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. So courage is not the absence of fear. It's not. It's about necessarily moving forward. So we do get a choice when we encounter fearful situations. We don't necessarily get a choice as to whether we would feel fear, but rather, will we let the fear stop us? The repercussions of that choice will have an obvious effect on other choices we make down the line, because it either opens us up or it closes us off. Now, as always, I have a disclaimer here. Sometimes fear is telling us something important, as was the case with that nearly unnoticed speeding car. Fear is not necessarily something to be ignored. And sometimes fear is providing a message. And within that message, there's a variety of choices. Let me explain this. The basic message of fear is, this is something you must pay attention to. Kind of like pain. People think of pain as something to avoid. Well, pain does have a message to it. And the message of pain is, hey, something's wrong. Deal with this. Pay attention. So the same is true when we talk about fear. There's something we must pay attention to. Now, the choices depend on circumstances, conditions, relationships, ignorance, our belief, our knowledge, our mindset, our values, all of these things, just to name a few. Considering that we often fear what we don't know or understand, the choice to remain in ignorance or to become enlightened looms large. If we choose to remain in ignorance, or I suppose I have to be fair here, if we have no opportunity to gain the knowledge we need, we may very well be inviting anxiety to come along for the ride as well. Simply put, we can become anxious that we're fearful. if it is a matter of ignorance, when we see that anxiety and that fear start to build, that is a clear message. Because choosing not to deal with anxiety can produce fear. My VR experience was a perfect example of that. So, how do you choose to avoid or dispel fear or anxiety? Should you choose to avoid or dispel them? Well, in the case of anxiety, I would say, yeah, absolutely. I just don't see that there's anything to be gained by holding on to anxiety. Now, please understand what I'm saying here. There's a difference between feeling anxiety and holding on to it. I mean, we're humans. We will, from time to time, be anxious, and there's good reason for it. But whether or not we're going to hold on to that anxiety, whether or not we're going to address it, that's the issue. And that is where we have our choice. Now, fear, well, that's a more, let's call it a more involved choice as to whether we choose to avoid or dispel it. Many times, people who are anxious can avoid or dispel their anxiety by choosing to take an action. Like they can ask questions, they can explore options, they can weigh consequences, become more aware, become more informed. Sometimes it involves choosing to ask ourselves where the anxiety is coming from. Meaning, is this something that you are anxious about, or have you inherited that anxiety, so to speak, from someone else? Choosing to dispel or overcome fear is most definitely something we can and should do. But it also depends on circumstances, depends on a mindset. One of the most powerful ways to overcome fear is through knowledge. Because we tend to fear what we don't understand. Now, that can be something that's situational. It can be something associated with a given activity. It can be associated with a thing, or even a demographic. Our recent experiences with COVID provided an unfortunately readily available set of examples. Being fearful of the consequences of a serious COVID infection certainly seems reasonable. But how that fear plays out in our lives, well, that can run the gamut from mild concern to outright dread. Prior to the pandemic, if you saw a group of people wearing masks and they walk into a bank, you'd probably be fearful. Then there were definitely times at the height of COVID, a group of people walking into the bank without masks could evoke a fear response. Pre-COVID, someone who wouldn't shake your hand might be cause for concern. Like, what's going on with them? At the height of COVID, that same handshake might become a highly questionable action. It's like, oh, we'll do the elbow thing. One of the most complex choices we make relative to fear and anxiety has to do with how we discern cause and effect. Okay, how we discern cause and effect, and therefore assign responsibility. Again, I'll use COVID as an example. There was a time when it was being called by some notable individuals in power the Chinese virus, which then caused a significant number of people to fear anyone they thought was Chinese. Of course, we humans do have a long history of assigning blame for illness to different ethnic groups or nationalities. Activist and author Susan Sontag addressed this when she wrote that syphilis was called the French pox by the English Morbus Germanicus by the Parisians, the Naples sickness by the Florentines, and the Chinese disease by the Japanese. Here's a clear indication of how ignorance leads to fear, and fear can lead to choices which are potentially dangerous. Another example. At its outset, AIDS was considered a gay disease, which allowed it to spread far and wide among non-gays. The logic, if you can call that the right word, the logic was, well, if I don't identify as gay, then I'm not at risk. And as a result, many, many lives were affected or lost. You know, we look at so-called primitives and how they feared things like lightning and thunder out of ignorance. Yet we still, as a species, fear what we don't understand. And our choices to build walls, to exclude races, to demonize those who aren't, quote unquote, like-minded to us, of course, are indicative of that fear. So while we might be encouraged to feel the fear and do it anyway, which is something that you've probably heard or possibly you've read the book, there are times that we can choose to eliminate fear through learning, by being open, by changing our perspective. Those are all choices, folks. And all of those can work wonders with anxiety as well. Of course, there are times that the choices we make, which are seemingly driven by fear, are perfectly good choices. I mean, shoring up the banks of a river before a big storm, evacuating one's home to escape a wildfire. Perfectly good choices. I wonder, though, because I think in reality, those choices were made through knowledge, understanding and weighing the consequences of action and inaction. So we took the fear as a message. The message was, you need to be prepared. There is something dangerous here. And then we took action and we addressed and alleviated the fear. If you've listened to some of my other shows, you know that I've mentioned the medallion that I wear, which says in Latin on one side, "Remember you will die," which that certainly can evoke fear. And on the other side of the medallion, it says, "Remember to live," which is precisely the response one could use to mitigate that fear. And coincidentally, that choice can perhaps bring you to a fuller experience of your life. One of the best questions you can ask yourself when you're feeling fearful or when you're anxious is why? Why do I feel this way? If it's because you just don't know what's going to happen, the next question might very well be, why not imagine a good outcome as opposed to a negative outcome? And folks, remember, the title of this show is Choice, Your Creative Superpower. So use that superpower. If you can create a frightening story, you can just as easily create an uplifting story. And, you know, the reality of life is we don't know what's going to happen. We could, if we focus on that aspect of life, we could be in fear or anxiety forever. Right. How you choose to address your life makes a huge difference. If you're feeling anxious, you can choose to explore ways to mitigate the anxiety. What if I don't have enough, insert word here? Well, why not choose to find out more about the requirements of your situation and plan ahead. Life certainly presents us with many things which legitimately cause fear or anxiety. But we have the ability to reduce that number significantly through our choices. I'll finish up today with these two quotes. First one is from Jodi Picoult. She says, "Anxiety's like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it doesn't get you very far." And from Rudyard Kipling, "Of all the liars in the world, sometimes the worst are our own fears." Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. If you'd be willing to share your thoughts and feelings about anxiety or fear, hey, be brave. Email me at zodemuro@gmail.com. As always, know that I am interested in hearing your ideas for additional topics that you'd like to see me cover on this show. Please do feel free to send me that email. Folks, I want to thank you for spending this time with me this week. Oh, hey, Christopher, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so I would strongly recommend that you go to ntmedia.org. Check out all that we have to offer there. There's prayer, meditation, information, discussion. We've got it all. We have music too, New Thought music at ntmedia.org/listen. Great stuff. More than 40 hours of programming each week, and we're building more. Today, perfect example. Today, 12 noon Pacific time. That's 1 p.m. Mountain time. Check out Finding the Joy in the Journey. My good friend and mentor, the Radiant Reverend Gina Calvario-Krupka. I strongly recommend that you explore, that you learn, that you find ways to make your life the most it possibly can be. I look forward to seeing you next week. Until we meet again, choose wisely. Much love and many, many blessings. Namaste.
Choice, your creative superpower. We have the power to manifest as we dedicate attention to our thoughts, but often miss opportunity to achieve the greatest good. Your superpower is waiting to be unleashed to unlock a fuller, more rewarding world for all. Join us every Thursday at noon Mountain Time for Choice, your creative superpower with Zoe DeMuro.